EarthBound is interesting. It's sort of like an anti-RPG in many ways. Yes, it's often considered among the most influential and even the greatest in the genre, even very recently by IGN, who ranked it number 7 out of their top 25. So then the obvious answer to the video's title is no, right? Of course it's not a bad RPG. It can't be. But then you remember IGN also wrote the Too Much Water review. It's a complicated question though, and we're going to get to the bottom of it, so that we can see how this game, with so many outright anti-RPG elements and more, add up to being considered among the all-time greats. So the first step is to answer the question of what an RPG even is. They've been around for quite a while now, but there doesn't really seem to be a consensus. So what is an RPG? Well, according to my grandpa, who I asked this question to when I was 8, it means rocket-powered grenade. So yes, for a while I did think the full title was Super Mario Rocket-Powered Grenade. But it turned out not to be the case. It really stands for role-playing game. So let's define these terms and put them together, applying them to EarthBound along the way. First is role-playing. Now, this is a really important one to be clear on, since, well, technically role-playing is part of almost every video game.
It's supposed to be a RPG. What role am I playing? The f***ing victim?
Most games have you, the player, assuming a role of some sort, with varying degrees of definition to the characters. So, what fundamentally makes the role being played in an RPG different? Is the term so broad that it's meaningless? I don't necessarily think so. I found the RP in RPG typically is defined by two major things. Some degree of character customization, which can be as simple as choosing the playable character's name and armor.
You entered douchebag, is that correct?
To as complex as adjusting even the chin structure. And 2, some sort of structured decision making to determine the character's development, which we'll come back to in a little bit. This is the pillar that I think generates investment on the player's end differently from other genres. The ability to self-insert is where much of the silent protagonist trope in the genre comes from, to allow the player to project themselves into the role.
What do you say? Not very much, I imagine.
So what does EarthBound do in regard to the role-playing element? It allows the player to name the main characters, pretty standard. The main character is largely a blank slate, plenty of room to project oneself into, but let's not skim past the nuance of Ness I've seen so many do. I've done videos in the past about it, but let me be clear. Ness is a character with a lot more depth than he's given credit for. Magicant is the instance that stands out to many for giving him dimension, but there are several instances in which the player is roped into defining his character in a very intentional way. There are even instances where he outright defies any sense of self-insertion on the player's end. Aside from Ness himself though, the game unreservedly severs the player from him, asking their name and turning them into a pseudo-character towards the end. The game is actually somewhat forcing a specific role onto the player in this sense, alluded to by Paula's mom. It's weird, but the game almost puts the player in a place to assume two roles, as the player and as Ness, but draws a clear line that Ness is a separate person from them, with his own agency to some extent.
I don't look anything like this guy.
It also allows you to have some interjection on the stats, to customize them, though not by much. The bigger piece here is customizing them through their equipment and armor, which have distinct differences in terms of stats, affinities, and effects. So on a strict yes-no basis, yes, EarthBound does fulfill this core requirement. Next, we'll need to define game, which on the surface sounds really simple. Just look at the definition, any organized form of play. But we're not defining game on its own, we're defining it in relation to role-playing. How the two intertwine is what we're trying to understand, so we need to be specific. To answer this question, we need to take a quick look back on how RPGs have changed over the years. RPGs began here, on the table, but before those ones. They have their roots in wargaming, a genre heavily defined by turn-based, in-depth strategic movement and combat.
Oh!
The first tabletop RPGs as we know them didn't come along until much later. Dungeons & Dragons didn't come about until the mid-1970s. Nonetheless, they did retrospectively make prior games able to be slightly recategorized. Their eventual emergence, however, didn't suddenly make Sorry a role-playing game because you assume the role of whatever this thing is, but gave some new dimension to those with sprinkles of its elements. But proper RPGs themselves elevated the creativity within them, as opposed to other games. They leaned much more on their imaginative element, utilizing their more developed worlds as a playground for it, making the options virtually limitless, unlike Sorry. With the later emergence of the CRPG, that is, computer RPG, suddenly that playground had a very clear fence drawn around it. There were, and are, just more limits in this regard.
Type help.
Don't be silly.
What? I've never played a game that when you type help, it says don't be silly.
A programmer just can't account for every single possible choice a player might make if they were playing a traditional TTRPG. Our imaginations are just too big, and a cartridge or ROM file can only hold so much data, not to mention time and other constraints on developers' ends.
There's no reason at this phase that the log should just be walking on its own. It's the magic log right there.
So really, how do we even quantify these questions? Well, the ways they worked in this regard, integrating the role-playing into the game, had to change, getting back to determining their character development. Some games set sort of rules for it. One way is allowing the player to spec their character through their stats or other customization, and this is where level ups stem from. You can already see how the role-playing and game are beginning to blend together. A popular way this may be done is through dialogue options to let them have a degree of control over the character's demeanor, albeit still limited. A great example of this is the Persona series' choice-based relationship advancement, as it feeds right back into the other gameplay elements. One of the coolest ways I've seen designers tie mechanics into main character development is in Dark Souls 2. There's this huge door you're supposed to open by defeating 4 major bosses, but if you've earned 1 million souls or more, you can just push it open with your bare hands. Typically, RPGs aren't games that have a story out of necessity, but as a driving force. Like, a shooter might have a campaign because it used to be accepted that you can't sell a game for full price without single-player content. But an RPG is made so that a story can be told, and all the mechanics surrounding it are to elevate the experience of that story. Mother 3 wasn't a cool combat system that needed an emotional and deep narrative to sell, it was the other way around. So I think we can define the game portion roughly as mechanics that utilize gameplay in service to the larger narrative. This is a bit vague though, so let's be a little less specious. Pretty much any genre can fit under the RPG header. You may think puzzle games don't, but they certainly can if the narrative and character progression is tied into the puzzle solving. This is how action RPGs can exist and still very much be RPGs, because the historic turn-based combat can absolutely be dropped. You could even give the character a gun instead, so long as the character-defined gameplay is intact with a narrative focus. Even narrative can take a massive backseat and still definitively feel like an RPG. Giving the player a certain amount of blanks to fill in with their imagination keeps them engaged in the story. This is what sews the role-playing and game together into the RPG. So, using what we've collected so far, we can actually build out a sort of spectrum of RPGs. This all gives us this gradient, demonstrating a game's purity in the genre. All it really needs to remain on the gradient is some amount of these two cores, or pillars. And now let's resume analyzing EarthBound with the 2 commandments. The game gives the player very modest dialogue trees, if you can even call them that, always coming down to yes and no answers, though there is specialized dialogue for each instance to craft character moments as small as they are, by having the NPCs make suggestions about Ness through their responses. This can also be seen in an interesting moment at the very end of the game, where the player can outright refuse to take Paula home and even have her included in the ending. It's small, but it's there. Another way EarthBound integrates the two can be seen in the mounds of situational dialogue throughout it. Some of the NPCs' dialogue changes after like every story beat and can only be seen if specific elements are completed in a specific way. This gives the world a richness of life, making it feel more lived in by its inhabitants instead of just like a video game. They also break the fourth wall though, which some might argue perverts the immersion. More on this later. Some might not see this as all contributing to this point, but I have to insist that talking to NPCs is and always has been a part of RPG's gameplay, even going back to tabletop, collecting information from the townsfolk, or in EarthBound's case, hearing this guy farted. So, in the game portion, yes, EarthBound also checks that box. So, in terms of its RPG purity, I'd say it lands around here. But this doesn't actually tell us if that makes it a good RPG or not. I mean, Dragon Quest could go here, but that doesn't make it necessarily a better RPG than EarthBound, only tells us how faithfully it maintains the fundamentals. While the building blocks we've been using are helping us to figure this out, I don't think IGN ranked EarthBound so high because it has turn-based combat. Right now we have a list of bullet points, but art is far more than a collection of observations. It's trying to understand those choices, their reasoning, and then attempting to extract meaning from them. We now know EarthBound's place in the realm of tradition, but to find out its quality as an RPG, we still need to dig a bit deeper. So, how do the decisions made that actively detract from the pure RPG status enhance or diminish the experience of EarthBound? Do any of the choices I described earlier as anti-RPG actually help to build a more immersive experience? Coming back to fourth wall breaks, they can be seen as a direct attack on the player's immersion. If RPGs are all about doing what's in service to the narrative, isn't this clearly a strike against it? Well, I just don't think it's that simple. While they can be used in ways that end up undercutting a moment's power,
Go get him, Tiger! Big CGI fight coming up!
EarthBound uses them to connect the game's world more to the real one, through pop culture references and addressing the player. I found they end up making the world feel more immersive by, for one, making it feel more true to the modern day setting it takes place in, which was an important bridge to gap, seen as the series pioneered this, which has since become a trope. 2, by using humor to encourage further conversation with NPCs, which, as we went over earlier, is important to the RPG experience, creates a sort of loop of immersion. Even the acknowledgements of the player are kept to a minimum, and are only done so that they can lead to a powerful moment that directly involves the player themselves, not the characters, into the story, in an attempt to truly make them part of it. It can't be ignored though that some of these really do extract the player from the experience at hand. It really comes down to the question of what crosses the line, as in, when does the game go too far?
I may have gone too far in a few places.
I would like to defend many of these instances for one major reason: their placement. Most acknowledgements of the game itself are during what I'm calling wind-down periods. Many are in ONET at the very beginning of the game, a relatively lax part of the story, where the player hasn't really even been in the world long enough to truly be disenchanted by it. And the cuteness of many of them help endear the player to the unfolding world in a way that ends up allowing themselves to be more drawn into it. Another section is in Fourside, where a sequel to EarthBound is teased. This is another wind-down moment, where the player is just exploring Fourside and the plot eases up to feel more open, so I see it as no harm, no foul. Same goes for the tea breaks, which also literally break up the gameplay, setting them aside. And finally, some are hidden during the ending of the game, which some may argue is an important point to be fully immersed in. But I would again counter that this placement makes sense. This is a moment where the player is getting ready to pack their bags and leave this world. And this is the game's way of driving them to the airport, so to say.
Just go home! That's your home!
And it gives it that touch of bittersweetness, emotionally resonating even more. Let's talk some mechanics now, starting with a particularly important one: the scrolling HP meter. While it's iconic to the game's identity, its role as an element in an RPG is questionable. What is it trying to draw from the player in an in-game sense, as in, what's it meant to simulate in relation to the characters? It's not especially clear, but it does serve to create drama within the fights, by giving the player a chance to race to save themselves from a fatal blow. In Mother 1, this wasn't possible. You take damage, it's gone. It felt much less predictable in this way. This worked in the roleplay dimension of the mechanics though, as it made taking a hit feel like taking a hit. And I'm not necessarily saying that this way is better than that, especially seeing as Mother 3 executed this concept far better, and probably closer to what Mother 2 was going for. But I'm saying regardless of its varying success, it's clearly meant to be in service of drawing the player in, to give each fight a story, which all good fights should have. Most of the fights mechanically are not overly connected to the written story of the characters, with some exceptions, and the slot machine aesthetic doesn't really lend to this either, intentional or not. The first-person perspective attempts to make up for this, but then you could also say the trippy backgrounds detract from it. Black backgrounds in many preceding RPGs weren't only due to limitations, they served as a void for players to project their imaginations onto. The battle backgrounds are somewhat filling this in for the player, but it's overall more in service of directing the player's mood. This scene setting is just detailing rather than robbing a player of their imagination. They are also mostly reflective of the surroundings the player had seen just before. This is another concession of more visual RPGs like this, as prior to them, the visuals were very limited, not filling in any sort of blanks for the player beyond what the DM said. The game also heavily de-emphasized grinding, a staple of the genre. Even back then, a game's last ability was an issue, so a lot of games just threw some BS in here and there, and in RPGs this manifested in fighting the same enemies over and over and over again, and making each battle be a pseudo-pause to the game continuing. This game also brought in auto wins, which was a pretty radical decision for the time, since it reduces the game's playtime, which was an especially valuable asset to producing RPGs. And as a side note, yes, I'm aware that this was a suggestion of Shigeru Miyamoto, but at the end of the day, it was a toy who decided to incorporate it.
I really feel somehow like a chosen person.
It innovates the genre by streamlining it while also feeding into the immersion of the player, making them both measurably stronger and feel stronger. It's an example of resisting tradition without breaking any fundamentals, and strengthening the overall experience. It recognized tedious, repetitive battles, which plague many great RPGs even to this day, are actually often working directly against its goals. Like a waste of time as opposed to organically growing stronger, it keeps the focus on story and progression rather than artificial padding. They really did care about the player emotionally connecting with both the story at hand and their numbers increasing, and I think it really works. The final boss is a major point to bring up, because it's here that the game puts you in a specific box, where story is the only way to continue the battle, contrary to many other RPGs, where the battles serve to continue the story. In most, you do enough damage to continue the story. Here, you progress the story in order to do more damage, and eventually win the fight. What some might find controversial, however, is its use of what some might say is flat-out emotional manipulation, by forcing the player into a position where their reaction is telegraphed by the game rather than having player input determine any aspect. I implore anyone with this view, however, to understand that art, at its core, is an experience all about emotion, so there is room here to say its mileage will just vary from player to player. If someone is really invested in the story, it'll probably really work, and for those not, it probably won't. I do, however, think the game does really build up to this sequence very well, particularly in its last couple hours. What's interesting is how influential this decision has become, it having the characters call on the people of the world the designers have been doing everything they can to draw the player into as a final resort, though I'm limiting my examples here as to not spoil too many games. And I think it may just show how unique storytelling in RPGs is, as when done effectively, many players will forgive what might be a complaint in other games, and even consider it one of the most important parts. This just may be the most famous and adored part of EarthBound. It just so happens to flip some of the conventions of the genre on its head, yet it makes the story that much stronger. It's honestly hard to even really play devil's advocate here, to criticize it as undercutting the experience somehow, especially when two more traditionally oriented phases of bosses come just before it. The mechanics and roleplay elements are a tool for the gameplay to be in service of the greater narrative, so it's all still working towards this objective, which is part of what the storyteller, the game designer's job is. The Dungeon Master. So then, to what scope is the role of a game designer versus a dungeon master the same? A DM doesn't design the mechanics of D&D, they merely project the story onto them. Well, I would argue that this is a game designer's role, no matter what genre they're designing for. There are select exceptions for those that served as the debut for their respective genres, but this was far from the first RPG. It wasn't even the first in its series, for video games, at all. And likewise, I find the technical flourishes, like the slot machine health, to be extensions of this, as they're still rooted firmly in the fundamentals. An RPG game designer's job is just an evolution of this role in a sense, so I would say the responsibilities are largely the same. And this is where I would say a toy as the Dungeon Master is the most evident. It really can't be understated how much a toy's writing carries the game's simple mechanics. If the end-all to much of the individual pieces is, does it benefit the story, then that is a heavy yes. It's in all of this that we can see the evolution of a medium. EarthBound, which spun from Mother 1, which in turn spun from the Dragon Quest games, ended up becoming massively influential to RPG writing down the line, to the point it's virtually spawned its own subgenre. Now we can't say to what level EarthBound has changed the genre as a whole, but we can clearly see how it broke open a whole new slew of ways for game designers to immerse players into stories. And as a gaming community, we've accepted that this is valuable to this art form. There is definitely a crowd out there that might have a problem with the idea of just any group of people being able to over time redefine a form of art, but this has always been the case, be it literature, painting, film, photography, you name it. And the movements that weren't influential and faded away were just that, fads. And as we've seen, 30 years removed from EarthBound's release, this hasn't been the case with it. It does make one wonder though, does conforming to established genre tropes and norms hold something back from its true potential? It certainly can, but is this the case for EarthBound? I don't really think so. Some things just feel more like holdovers from conventions of RPG design at the time. This doesn't mean it harms the experience, but it can in other cases. Would Final Fantasy VII have been better if all of Cloud's character was stripped away in favor of him being a blank slate just so the player could self-insert? Though that angle is definitely why they pushed the love triangle. Would Deltarune be better if it wasn't a bullet hell and instead calculator-style turn-based combat? No. Their diverting from the tropes are what make them standout examples of RPGs, ironically, as they created new ways to immerse the player to better deliver their narratives. But again, the core elements are still there. Don't get me wrong, EarthBound has shortcomings. I just don't think they stem from it being an RPG. So what does this mean in terms of EarthBound as an RPG? Throughout this case study, it's become much less a question of purity versus impurity, and more one of if the executions of the elements are effective. Is the role-playing portion effective in immersing the player and telling the story? And the same goes for the gameplay being in service to the immersion and storytelling as well. Starting with the effectiveness of how it holds to Pillar 1. Ness is a character the game attempts to have its cake with and eat too, giving the player a self-insert that it then goes on to largely define, and giving the player a separate role that essentially boils down to player. That said, it's still there, has a degree of role-playing, and is in service to the story. And the writing elevates the world and has led to so many innovations in the genre without breaking any formal rules. And now on to Pillar 2. Elements are there to attempt to utilize the gameplay to immerse the player in the story, and even though then major advancements in RPG design. Further, there is also player customization in a very traditional sense, but conventions aren't everything, and rules were made to be broken. And I think some of these rule breaks led to a far better RPG than maybe was possible only 5 to 10 years prior to it. Yes, it holds to these two pillars, but even at its most contrarian, many of its choices actually make it stronger. With all this, I think we can finally draw a conclusion. So, my final verdict is this. EarthBound literally changed the game, and I think it really shows us we're still discovering things within something even as established as a genre, an artistic medium, or even just one specific game. EarthBound's place among RPGs is like discovering a new sense you never knew you had, because the instrument to sense it just wasn't there to do so yet. And I think, as corny as it sounds, that instrument for EarthBound is your heart. So I think this all adds up to definitively say, EarthBound is a good RPG, even a great one. I think all of this is what drafts it this high in IGN's list. It's not perfect. As an RPG, this is what I'd call the definition of unorthodox. It transgresses them in so many ways, and not always successfully, but it's also paved the way for so many that have emerged since that nobody would question for a second about their respective quality. It draws the player into a world, lets them really feel like a part of it, and does so in order to enrich their life with a grand story. It truly immerses the player in an experience like no other, despite how many have tried to since. And it's not just a good RPG, or even a great RPG, but one of the great RPGs. Thank you for listening to me ramble about this game I love again, and I'll see you soon.